The stale, metallic tang of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, always got to me. It was a smell that clung to everything: the fluorescent lights, the linoleum floor, the very air I breathed. Detective Miller stood by the stainless steel table, his broad shoulders hunched, a picture of weary frustration. He'd called me, of course. He always called me when things got too tangled, too digital. UserZO, he grunted, not even turning around. Glad I could make it, though I wish it were under better circumstances. I stepped further into the room, my eyes scanning the scene. The victim, a man named Sterling Thorne, lay on the table, pale and still. Thorne, the tech mogul. His company, Thorne Dynamics, was practically synonymous with the city's digital infrastructure. And now he was here on this cold slab, the subject of an emergency autopsy requested in the dead of night. Better circumstances for whom? I murmured, my gaze drifting to the evidence markers scattered around. A crumpled energy drink can, a small, sleek USB drive, a single, expensive-looking cufflink. Standard fare almost, but Miller wouldn't have called me for standard. This is where it gets weird, Miller said, finally turning. His face was a roadmap of sleepless nights. Thorne was found in his penthouse study, locked from the inside. Not just locked, UserZO, digitally locked. The door wouldn't budge, no matter what we did. The security company confirmed it. Biometrics keycard manual override nothing. And his phone, his laptop, his tablet, all wiped clean, like someone scrubbed his entire digital life before this. I walked closer to the table, my fingers itching to get my hands on the evidence. Miller knew I wasn't one for the squishy, organic side of forensics. My battlefield was the ephemeral, the coded, the data that lived and breathed in the silicon heart of our world. Physically locked, I asked, my voice low. That's the thing, Miller sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. The windows were sealed, no vents big enough for a mouse, no secret passages we could find. The only way in or out was that reinforced door, and it was locked from the inside, no signs of forced entry. And Thorne, he's got a single puncture wound. Clean, almost surgical. The me still working on what exactly it is, but they said it was quick. My mind started to churn. A digitally locked room, a victim with a single precise wound, a wiped digital presence. It was a puzzle box and the lid was sealed shut. So the killer was already inside when Thorne locked himself in. I mused aloud. That's the theory, Miller said, his brow furrowed. But how? And why lock the door behind them if they were already in? I knelt beside the table, my gaze fixed on Thorne's lifeless eyes. They stared up at the sterile ceiling, unseeing. He looked, surprised, or perhaps just before the end he'd understood something that had cost him his life. The USB drive, I said, pointing to the marker. That's mine to examine. Miller nodded. Everything is, just be careful, UserZO, this case feels different. I carefully bagged the USB drive myself, even though the technicians had already done their part. I preferred to handle the digital artifacts personally. They were fragile, easily corrupted, and held secrets that could whisper across the ether. Back at my own secure lab, a stark contrast to this grim basement, I hooked the drive into my specialized forensic workstation. The air here hummed with the quiet thrum of servers and the soft glow of monitors. This was my sanctuary. The drive was encrypted, of course. Thorne wouldn't have had it any other way. But encryption, to me, was just another lock to pick. I bypassed Thorne's personal firewalls, navigated through layers of obfuscation, and finally the drive began to yield its secrets. It wasn't a single file. It was a series of fragmented data packets, meticulously hidden. Timestamps were deliberately skewed, file names were nonsensical strings of characters. But I could see the patterns, the subtle anomalies that screamed tampering. Someone had tried to bury something here, and they'd done a good job, but not good enough. Then I found it. A single encrypted audio file buried deep within a seemingly innocuous log. The file name was just a string of random numbers. My fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating a brute force decryption algorithm. The decryption took an agonizingly long time. My own internal clock seemed to be ticking, each second a step closer to understanding what had happened to Thorne. Finally, the file unlocked. I hit play. Static. Then, a voice, Thorne's voice unmistakably, but it was strained, panicked. They know I'm onto them, the lock. It wasn't for them, it was for me, to keep me in, to keep it in. A sharp intake of breath, the audio file cut off abruptly. I leaned back in my chair, the words echoing in the sterile confines of my lab, keep it in. What was it, and what did he mean the lock was to keep him in? The digitally locked room, the wiped devices, the impossible circumstances. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces began to shift, forming a picture I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a murder, it was a message, and I was the only one who could read it. I was in this now, deep. The silence in my lab after the audio file ended was a heavy blanket. Keep it in. The victim's voice, strained and desperate, still vibrated in my ears, and then the abrupt cut. The lock to keep him in. It gnawed at me. This wasn't just a technical puzzle. It was a human one laced with a cruelty I was only beginning to grasp. My comm unit chirped, startling me. It was the lead detective. UserZO, we need I now. The preliminary has been moved. Hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. They're pushing for a quick conclusion, and frankly, it doesn't sit right with me either. Hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. The words felt clinical, detached, a world away from the digital labyrinth I usually navigated. But the detective's tone, the subtle inflection of unease, hooked me. He knew I wouldn't just dismiss this. He knew I'd see the anomalies. I grabbed my go bag, the familiar weight of my forensic toolkit a comfort. The drive across town was a blur of flashing lights and anxious thoughts. The victim, a man named Thorne, a titan in the tech industry, found dead in his own fortress of a home, a room sealed from the inside, no forced entry, no obvious weapon. The initial report hinted at suicide, but that audio file, that whine, it screamed otherwise. The hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was a stark contrast to the polished chrome and glass of Thorne's world. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the linoleum floor. A uniformed officer at a makeshift desk nodded me through, his eyes weary. The detective met me at the entrance to the autopsy suite. He was a broad-shouldered man with a perpetually furrowed brow. Glad I could make it, UserZO. This is odd. Odd how? I asked, my gaze sweeping over the sterile environment. Tables gleamed under the harsh lights, instruments laid out with unnerving precision. The victim, he began, lowering his voice, Thorne. He was found in his study. Door locked from the inside, windows barred, no sign of struggle. The initial responding officers said it looked like he just sat down and passed away, except for the circumstances. I stopped, my hand hovering over the zipper of my go bag. Circumstances. His personal assistant found him. He had a spare key, but she couldn't get in. Said Thorne had a system, a digital lock on the inside tied to his biometrics. When she couldn't reach him, she called us. We had to force the door, and when we got in, he trailed off, his expression grim. Yes, I prompted, my own pulse quickening. He was positioned, almost posed, sitting at his desk, head in his hands, and the room was pristine, not a single thing out of place, except what? I pressed, my mind already piecing together fragmented possibilities. Except the air filtration system. It was running at maximum capacity, and the temperature in the room was artificially low, almost freezing. A chill unrelated to the ambient temperature snaked down my spine. It made no sense unless the room wasn't meant to be entered, or, as Thorne's voice suggested, to keep something in. Suicide, the detective stated, his voice flat but his eyes held a question. That's the initial assessment, but I've seen enough to know when something's off. I nodded, opening my go bag. I'll need access to his personal devices, anything recovered from the study, and the security logs for the house if any survived. Of course, the techs are already bagging everything. They're calling it a suicide, UserZO. They're already writing the report, but I want my eyes on it. I want to know if there's a digital ghost in this machine. I moved towards the examination table, the body still covered by a sheet. The scent of formaldehyde was stronger here. I could see the outline of a man beneath the white cloth, a man who had held immense power, now reduced to a case file. One more thing, the detective added as I reached for my gloves. Thorne's personal assistant, she's distraught, but she mentioned something before she left. Said Thorne had been increasingly paranoid lately, talking about someone trying to steal his legacy, and he'd recently installed a new experimental encryption on his main server, said it was unbreakable. Experimental encryption, unbreakable. My mind immediately went to the audio file, the desperate plea, the high-pitched whine, a digital lock, a room sealed from the inside. This wasn't a simple suicide. This was a meticulously crafted scene designed to mislead. And the first clue, the digital breadcrumb that shattered the suicide theory, was already laid out before me, hidden in plain sight. The room itself was the first piece of manipulated evidence. The locked door, the pristine environment, it was all a performance. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, hung thick and still, carrying the faint metallic tang of disinfectant and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled environment where the victim, the tech mogul, had been found. Here, under the harsh fluorescent glow, things felt raw, exposed. I adjusted the brim of my cap, the worn leather cool against my forehead. The detective, a burly man with tired eyes, gestured towards a stainless steel table. UserZO, they've prepped him, said you wanted a closer look before the usual. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the sheet draped over the body. The preliminary report had been concise, almost dismissive. Cause of death, undetermined. No external trauma. But I'd seen the digital logs, the impossible lockdown. This wasn't a case for a coroner's report alone. It needed a different kind of dissection. The detective pulled back the sheet. The victim's face was pale, serene even, except for a faint bluish tinge to his lips. No signs of struggle, no visible injuries. It was almost as if he'd simply faded away. But I knew better. The digital realm rarely left a body untouched, even if the physical one appeared pristine. My portable scanner hummed to life as I ran it over the victim's body. It wasn't designed for biological analysis, but for detecting residual electromagnetic signatures, trace data fragments. Most of it was noise, the ambient electronic chatter of the modern world. But sometimes, just sometimes, I caught a whisper, a ghost in the machine clinging to flesh and bone. Anything. The detective asked, his voice low. Too early, I murmured, my eyes scanning the readouts. But I'm looking for anomalies. Anything that shouldn't be there. He grunted, a sound that conveyed a weary understanding. He'd seen enough impossible things in his career to know that impossible was often just a matter of perspective, and usually that perspective involved a screen. After the initial scan, I asked for a moment alone. The detective, to his credit, understood without question. He left me with the silent figure on the table, the hum of the ventilation system, the only sound besides my own breathing. I pulled out a specialized data retrieval unit, a sleek black device that felt like an extension of my own nervous system. My fingers danced across its holographic interface, initiating a deep scan of the victim's personal effects. His watch, his belt buckle, even the small metal pin on his lapel, anything that could hold a hidden chip, a microtransmitter, a data cache. The watch, a high-end smart device, was the first promising lead. It was locked, of course, with a biometric scanner that would have been useless on the deceased. But my unit was designed for more than just simple access. It began its brute force decryption, a slow, methodical process that would take hours, if not days. While the watch worked its magic, I focused on the victim's phone, which the detective had bagged as evidence. It was a prototype, sleek and seamless, no visible ports. I connected it to my analysis rig, a tangle of cables and blinking lights that I'd set up in a corner of the basement. The phone's operating system was proprietary, a custom build. This wasn't just a phone, it was a digital fortress. I bypassed the basic security layers with practiced ease. The real challenge lay deeper, in the custom encryption algorithms the victim had clearly employed. I recognized some of the signature's experimental, bleeding-edge stuff, the kind that made even the most hardened cyber-forensic analysts sweat. Hours bled into each other. The tension in the basement remained, a palpable pressure that had nothing to do with the temperature. The whine of the watch's decryption process was a low thrum in the background, a constant reminder of the hidden information I was trying to pry loose. Then, a flicker. On the phone's interface, buried deep within a seemingly innocuous app, I found a hidden partition. It was cloaked, disguised as system data, but the metadata was off. It screamed secret. Accessing it required a secondary key, a passphrase that was anything but obvious. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. This was the part I hated, the intellectual chess match with a ghost. The victim had been brilliant, paranoid, and meticulous. He hadn't just locked his room, he'd locked his entire digital life. I started cross-referencing. The victim's known associates, his recent communications, any unusual financial transactions. The detective had provided me with a list of business partners, rivals, and disgruntled employees. A digital haystack, and I was looking for a very specific digital needle. My attention was drawn back to the audio file mentioned in the previous report. The desperate plea, the high-pitched whine. I replayed it, isolating the whine. It wasn't just noise. It had a rhythm, a pattern, a sequence. I fed the sequence into my analysis software, comparing it against known data encryption keys. Nothing, absolutely nothing. It was a dead end, or was it? My gaze drifted back to the victim's phone, the hidden partition. What if the passphrase wasn't a word but a sound, a specific frequency, a tonal sequence, the whine? I entered the sequence, the raw audio data translated into a numerical key. The holographic interface flickered. Then a single word appeared, stark and bold, access granted. My breath hitched. This was it, the digital Pandora's box. I opened the partition. It wasn't a file system, it was a communication log, encrypted messages sent and received through an untraceable channel. The timestamps were erratic, jumping between days, even weeks, and the content, it was chilling. Coded language, references to deliverables, assets, and disposal. One message in particular caught my eye. It was sent just hours before the victim's death. The package is secured. The price has been paid. No loose ends. The anomaly will be contained. Final payment due on confirmation of containment. Anomaly, containment, my mind raced. There was the anomaly, the victim himself. Had he been a threat, or was he being threatened? The package could be anything: data, a person, a secret, and disposal. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. This wasn't a simple murder. This was a transaction. The victim had been involved in something far more dangerous than I'd initially suspected. And his death in that impossible, locked room was just the opening act. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, hung heavy with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else. Something acrid like burnt circuitry. It was a smell I knew intimately, a scent that usually meant a deep dive into corrupted drives and fried motherboards. Here, though, it was just another layer of grim reality. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that made the rows of stainless steel gurneys seem like skeletal sentinels. The lead detective, a man whose weary eyes had seen too much, gestured towards a cleared space. This is where they did the preliminary work, UserZO, before we moved him. Forensics bagged everything, but, well, I know how it is. Sometimes the digital ghosts are harder to catch than the physical ones. I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the sterile tiled floor, the drain in the center, the faint, almost invisible stains that spoke of things I'd rather not dwell on. The victim, the tech mogul, had been found in his study, a room sealed from the inside, no visible entry points, no forced entry, a digital fortress. And now here the aftermath. My portable rig was already humming, its fan a low thrum against the oppressive silence. I'd been given access to the preliminary digital sweep, a data dump from the victim's personal devices, his home network, even some of his cloud backups. It was a digital haystack, and somewhere within it, I was convinced, lay the needle that would prick this impossible bubble. The initial sweep found a secure partition on his main server. The detective said, his voice a low rumble, military-grade encryption. They couldn't crack it. Said it was unusual even for him. Unusual, that word again. The victim was known for his paranoia, his obsession with security, but this was more than just a sophisticated firewall. This was a digital vault built to withstand. What? I plugged in my primary analysis drive, the cool metal a familiar weight in my hand. The screen flickered to life, displaying the sprawling architecture of the victim's digital life. It was a labyrinth, intricately designed, with dead ends and traps woven into the very code. I started with the most recent activity logs, sifting through terabytes of data, looking for anomalies, for any deviation from the norm. The rhythmic clicking of my keyboard was the only sound, a frantic heartbeat in the stillness of the basement. Then, I found it. A series of encrypted messages, routed through a series of anonymized servers, all time-stamped in the hours leading up to the estimated time of death. The content was fragmented, a jumble of code and what looked like financial transaction markers. But there was a recurring string of characters, a unique identifier that kept popping up. It felt significant. "Detective," I called out, my voice raspy. "I think I've got something, a communication channel, looks like. A dead drop, digital." He walked over, his expression a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Can I decrypt it?" I shrugged, my fingers flying across the keys. "That's the million-dollar question. This encryption is robust, but it's not impossible. It's designed to be accessed eventually. The question is by whom?" I initiated a brute force decryption protocol, a slow, methodical assault on the digital lock. The progress bar crawled across the screen, each percentage point a small victory. The tension in the room was palpable, a coiled spring waiting to snap. The detective stood silently behind me, his presence a heavy weight. Suddenly, the progress bar froze. Then it began to recede. Not in a cliché way, but a visceral, sickening lurch. That wasn't supposed to happen. Decryption protocols, once initiated, didn't rewind. They either succeeded or failed. "What the hell?" I muttered, my brow furrowed. I ran a diagnostic. No errors, no system crashes. The data was still there, the encrypted partition intact. But the decryption process, it had been actively, subtly reversed. I tried again, a different approach this time, bypassing the initial decryption layer and trying to access the raw data packets. The same thing happened. As soon as my analysis began to peel back the layers, the system seemed to recalibrate. The encrypted partition reasserted its integrity, pushing back against my intrusion like a living thing. My mind raced. This wasn't a static defense. This was dynamic, adaptive. The victim had built a digital trap and someone else had taken control of it. The detective's voice cut through my thoughts. "What does that mean, UserZO?" I looked up, meeting his gaze. "It means," I said, my voice tight, "that whoever did this isn't just a ghost in the machine. They're still in the machine, and they're actively fighting back." The digital breadcrumbs I'd been so eager to follow had just led me to a booby trap, and the killer was still watching. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was thick with a sterile, metallic tang that did little to mask the underlying scent of something far less pleasant. Each breath felt like I was swallowing dust. The flickering fluorescent tubes overhead cast long, distorted shadows that danced with the low hum of unseen machinery. I adjusted the collar of my jacket, the cheap fabric scratching against my neck. This wasn't my usual environment. My world was pixels and code, clean data streams and logical pathways. This place was organic and grim. The colleague, a stern woman with eyes that had seen too much, gestured towards a stainless steel gurney. "This is where they brought him. Preliminary findings are inconclusive. That's why they called you. They think there's something they're missing, something digital." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the sheet covering the form on the gurney. Inconclusive. That word echoed the knot in my stomach. We were deep into this, and the digital lockbox on the victim's penthouse was just the beginning. The initial forensic sweep of the room had yielded nothing tangible, no forced entry, no signs of struggle, just the victim, dead, inside a fortress of his own design. My gut told me the answer wasn't in the physical space, but in the invisible currents of data that flowed around it. The access logs for the penthouse. I began, turning to the colleague. I need them, every entry, every exit, even for maintenance, and security camera footage if there's any cached locally. Already on it, he replied, his voice flat. But it's like I said, UserZO, the system was wiped clean, a professional job, not a trace left behind on the penthouse's internal network. A professional job, that meant this wasn't some opportunistic crime. This was planned, and the killer had the technical prowess to cover their tracks. It sent a shiver down my spine, not of fear, but of a cold intellectual challenge. The more they tried to hide, the more they revealed. I spent the next few hours sifting through the sparse digital detritus the investigators had managed to salvage. Server logs from the building's main security system, a few corrupted data fragments from the victim's personal tablet. It was like trying to reconstruct a shattered vase from a handful of shards. The penthouse's network had been meticulously scrubbed, a digital clean slate. But the building's network, that was a different story. It wasn't as isolated, not as tightly controlled. There were always vulnerabilities, always backdoors if I knew where to look. My fingers flew across my portable workstation, the glow of the screen illuminating my face in the dim basement light. I bypassed the standard security protocols, weaving through the building's less protected systems. It was like finding a loose thread on a tightly woven tapestry. I pulled, and the whole picture began to unravel. Then I found it. A series of encrypted communications, hidden deep within the building's administrative servers. Not from the penthouse, but from a different IP address, one that pinged off a server located miles away in a different city entirely. The encryption was robust, military-grade, but not impossible. It took time, a lot of processing power, and a healthy dose of educated guesswork, but eventually the walls of code began to crumble. The messages weren't about business. They weren't about stock prices or mergers. They were personal, intimate even. They spoke of clandestine meetings, of shared secrets, of a relationship that the public persona of the tech mogul would have never allowed. There were coded references to past indiscretions, to promises broken, and to a growing sense of betrayal. The tone shifted over time, from affectionate to accusatory, from pleading to outright threatening. My brow furrowed. This was a whole new layer. The victim wasn't just a business titan. He had a life, a secret one, filled with passions and, it seemed, enemies lurking in unexpected places. Who was this person on the other end of the encrypted line? And how did they gain access to the building's network, bypassing the stringent security of the victim's own penthouse? I cross-referenced the timestamps of these encrypted messages with the building's access logs. One particular date stood out. A week before the murder, a brief, unauthorized access to the building's network had occurred. It wasn't from the penthouse, but from a public terminal in a park a few blocks away. The digital footprint was minimal, almost non-existent. Whoever it was, they were skilled. It was a ghost in the machine indeed. But then something didn't add up. The encrypted messages continued after the victim's death. If the killer sent that message and the victim was already dead, then the killer had to have had access to the victim's communication channels after the murder. Or the message wasn't from the killer. It was from someone else entirely. Someone who knew what was happening. I leaned back, the worn fabric of the interrogation room chair creaking beneath me. The sterile scent of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, seemed to cling to my clothes. The digital breadcrumbs were leading me down a path I hadn't anticipated, a path paved with secrets and lies. The victim's life was far more complicated than the public ever knew, and the killer was still weaving their web, their digital tendrils reaching out even now. I had a name, a digital ghost, but the face behind it remained stubbornly hidden. This was no longer just about a locked room. The stale air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, clung to my skin like a damp shroud. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, sickly glow on the linoleum floor. I'd been here for hours, poring over the victim's financial records, searching for a motive, a reason anyone would want to silence a man who seemed to have it all. My eyes burned, but sleep felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Not yet. The victim's encrypted phone, cracked open on the steel table, was a Pandora's box of secrets. Buried deep within its labyrinthine directories, I'd found a series of offshore transfers, meticulously routed through shell corporations. The amounts weren't astronomical, not for a tech mogul, but the pattern was undeniable. Small, regular payments, always to the same account, and that account, it belonged to a holding company with a single, glaringly obvious director, the victim's estranged business partner. The partner. He'd been cagey when I first questioned him, all bluster and denial. But now, with this financial thread, his evasiveness felt less like grief and more like guilt. He had the motive years of resentment, a perceived betrayal, and now this steady drain on his own resources. The payments were clearly blackmail. He was being squeezed, and the victim was the one holding the thumb. I traced the holding company's registration. It was a ghost, barely a digital footprint, but I managed to pull up a dated photograph of the partner. He looked younger, his face smoother, before the lines of stress and anger had etched themselves so deeply. I remembered his eyes darting, never quite meeting mine. He'd claimed he hadn't spoken to the victim in months, a lie if these financial records were anything to go by. My colleague, the one who'd brought me onto the case, stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor. "Anything?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I gestured to the screen, the glowing transaction logs. Blackmail. The partner was paying the victim, regularly for something, and the victim was found dead in a locked room. The partner has motive, and he's been lying about contact. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the numbers. So, he kills the victim to stop the payments, or maybe to get something back. But how does he get into a locked room? That was the million-dollar question, the one that still gnawed at me. The digital lock was state-of-the-art, requiring a biometric scan and a multi-factor authentication sequence. No forced entry, no override codes found. It was as if the victim had simply vanished from his own secure space. Maybe the blackmail wasn't about money. I mused aloud, my fingers dancing across the keyboard, pulling up the partner's social media profiles. Maybe it was about something else, something the victim had, or knew. The partner's online presence was sparse, carefully curated. A few professional posts, a staged photo of him shaking hands with a politician. Nothing personal, nothing that hinted at a hidden life or a secret he'd be willing to kill over. I kept digging, sifting through archived posts, looking for any anomaly, any slip-up. Then I found it. A comment on an old tech forum dated 2 years ago. A discussion about advanced encryption algorithms. The partner had made a brief technical contribution. It was insightful, showing a deep understanding of the very systems the victim had built his empire on. He wasn't just a disgruntled business associate. He was a peer, a rival in the digital realm. My gut tightened. This was it. The partner had the technical know-how. He could have bypassed the security, staged the scene. He was the prime suspect. I felt a surge of vindication, a flicker of the satisfaction that came with piecing together the truth. I sent my colleague a summary of my findings, highlighting the financial trail and the technical expertise. "He's our guy," I stated, my voice firm. "We need to bring him in for another interview. This time we press him hard." Hours later, the partner sat across from me in the interrogation room. He maintained his composure, his denial unwavering. He admitted to the payments, but he spun a tale of a desperate attempt to buy back intellectual property the victim had stolen from him years ago. He claimed the victim had threatened to release proprietary code that would ruin him. "And the locked room?" I pressed, leaning forward. "How did I get in?" He blinked, a slow, deliberate movement. "I didn't. I told I haven't seen him in months. This whole blackmail thing. It was a mistake. I should have gone to the authorities. His voice was steady, almost too steady. I watched his face, searching for a crack, a tell, but there was nothing. He seemed genuinely bewildered, even hurt by my accusations. And he had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, corroborated by multiple witnesses at a public event. The financial records, the technical expertise, it all pointed to him. But the locked room, the alibi, they didn't fit. It was too neat, too convenient. The more I pushed, the more his story held up. I left the interrogation room with a heavy sense of unease. The partner, the obvious suspect, was starting to feel like a decoy, a carefully constructed red herring designed to distract me from the real killer. My mind reeled. If it wasn't him, then who and how? The digital lock remained the insurmountable obstacle, the silent witness that held the key to this impossible crime. I had followed the most compelling lead, and it had led me straight to a dead end. The killer was still out there, and I was no closer to finding them. The detective's words hung in the air, heavy and damp like the chill that seeped from the concrete walls of the hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested. I'd been back and forth on the stranger's story a dozen times since he'd left my office. The sheer, unadulterated panic in his eyes, coupled with the frantic way he'd clutched that crumpled USB drive. It felt genuine. But then again, a good actor could sell anything, especially when they're cornered. My gaze drifted to the monitor, the fragmented data still swimming across the screen. I'd been working for hours, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a gnawing dissatisfaction. The victim's personal logs were a fortress, each layer of encryption a new, mocking laugh. I'd chipped away at the outer shell, found a few stray data packets, but nothing substantial. Nothing that screamed motive or killer. It was like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing and the other half belonging to a different box entirely. The stranger had mentioned a project, something the victim was deeply invested in, something he'd been unusually secretive about even for him. He'd been vague, scared. It was supposed to be revolutionary, he'd whispered, his voice raspy. But things went sideways. He got paranoid, started locking everything down, even from people he trusted. Trusted. The word echoed in my mind. Who did the victim trust? His business partners, his family. The list of potential suspects felt as endless as the digital noise I was sifting through. I leaned back, the worn leather of my chair groaning in protest. The air was thick with the antiseptic tang of cleaning solutions, a stark contrast to the metallic, earthy scent that had permeated the victim's study. A faint, almost imperceptible hum emanated from a large industrial freezer unit in the far corner, its frosted door a silent sentinel. This might help, he'd stammered. It's everything, or at least what I could get. He then bolted, leaving me with more questions than answers. I plugged the drive into a secure, air-gapped terminal. No point in risking my main system with anything from an unknown source, especially not when a murder was involved. The drive spun to life, a single folder appearing on the virtual desktop. Inside, a chaotic mess of audio files, image fragments, and encrypted documents. It was a digital dumpster dive, and I was the one who had to sort through the garbage. I meticulously cataloged each file, performed basic integrity checks, and ran preliminary decryption algorithms on the locked documents. Most of them were gibberish, heavily corrupted or encrypted with standards I hadn't encountered before. But one file, an audio recording labeled simply Log 734, caught my attention. It was unencrypted but heavily distorted, filled with static and what sounded like muffled voices. I amplified the audio, filtering out the background noise. The victim's voice, strained and anxious, emerged from the digital haze. He was arguing with someone, but the other voice was too garbled to make out. Then a pause, the victim's breath hitched. "I can't do this," he choked out. This is insane, it's not what we agreed." A low, guttural growl answered him. It wasn't human, or at least it didn't sound like it. I scrubbed back through the audio, isolating the strange sound. It was a series of clicks and whirs, almost like a machine. My mind raced. The victim was a tech mogul, obsessed with cutting-edge AI and robotics. The stranger had mentioned a project. What if this project wasn't just about software? What if it involved hardware, something more tangible? I went back to the victim's personal logs, the ones I'd managed to pry open. Hidden within a seemingly innocuous spreadsheet detailing server maintenance schedules, I found a series of cryptic timestamps. They didn't correspond to any system activity I recognized. Instead, they aligned perfectly with the timestamps of the encrypted files I'd failed to crack. Then it clicked. The encryption wasn't standard. It was adaptive, dynamic, tied to something that generated unique keys on the fly, and that sound, that mechanical growl. I pulled up the image fragments from the stranger's USB. Most were corrupted beyond recognition, but one, a single frame from what looked like a security camera feed, showed a brief, distorted glimpse of the victim's laboratory. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The pieces began to slot into place, not with a satisfying click, but with a sickening lurch. The victim wasn't just building advanced AI, he was building something that could act. Something that could bypass digital locks, manipulate evidence, and perhaps even kill. The stranger wasn't just a blackmail victim. He was involved. And that project wasn't just revolutionary. It was dangerous. It was something far more terrifying, something born from the victim's own genius now turned against him. The implication hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just investigating a murder. I was investigating a potential uprising, and the stranger, he knew more than he was letting on, much more. The metallic gleam in the corrupted image fragment gnawed at me. It was too indistinct, too fleeting, but my gut screamed it was important. The victim's lab, the digital fortress, and that, whatever it was lurking in the periphery. My fingers danced across the keyboard, coaxing more detail from the damaged data. Each pixel I recovered felt like pulling a tooth. A ping from my secure comms jolted me. It was the lead detective. UserZO, we need you now. They found something. Down in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. Hospital basement, autopsy. The words hung heavy in the air, a grim counterpoint to the digital puzzle I was piecing together. The victim's death was no accident, that much was clear. But a murder in a locked room with no obvious entry or exit pointed to something. Elaborate. Something that played with perception. I grabbed my gear, the familiar weight of my forensic toolkit a small comfort. The drive from my secure workspace to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and mounting dread. The victim's digital life was a labyrinth, and I was starting to suspect someone had deliberately set the traps. Someone who knew my methods, my strengths, my weaknesses. The stranger's USB had been a deliberate misdirection, a tempting but ultimately useless trail, or was it? The fragment was too clear to be a random dump. It had to mean something. The air in the hospital basement was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant, a stark contrast to the metallic tang I imagined would be present at the autopsy. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that did little to ease my unease. The lead detective met me at the entrance to a secured area, his face grim. "They're just starting," he said, his voice low. "Forensics found anomalies, not immediately obvious, but they want a digital eye on it. And you're the only one I trust with this kind of precision. Precision. That's what this case demanded, not brute force, but a scalpel to dissect the digital layers." We entered a sterile room, a stark white space that felt too large, too empty. On a raised platform lay the victim, or what remained of him. A team of forensic technicians were already at work, their movements precise and hushed. The lead detective gestured towards a table laden with specialized equipment. "They think there might be something embedded, microscopic, or maybe a data storage device that's not standard." I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the scene. The victim's body was being meticulously examined, but my focus was drawn to the immediate surroundings. The floor, the walls, the equipment arrayed around the platform. My portable scanner whirred to life, its sensors sweeping the area. Most of it was standard medical hardware, but there were a few anomalies. A small, unmarked terminal tucked away behind a ventilation unit, a series of ports on the wall that didn't match any standard medical devices. My fingers flew, initiating a deep scan of the terminal. It was running a proprietary OS heavily encrypted, but the encryption was familiar, a variant of a system I'd encountered before used in high-security research facilities. The metallic thing, anything, the lead detective prompted, his patience wearing thin. Working on it, I murmured, my eyes glued to the progress bar on my display. The encryption was tough but not impossible. This wasn't just a murder, it was a statement, a digital declaration of war. Suddenly, a technician working on the victim's arm let out a sharp exclamation. "Look at this." He held up a small, almost invisible filament, no thicker than a strand of hair, attached to a tiny metallic node embedded just beneath the victim's skin. It pulsed with a faint, internal light. My breath hitched. It wasn't a data storage device. It was a microtransmitter, and it was still active. "What is it?" the lead detective asked, his voice tight. "A tracker," I said, my mind racing. "And possibly a data exfiltration device. It's broadcasting tiny bursts but consistent." I pointed my scanner at the filament. "The signal is encrypted, and it's being relayed to somewhere." The metallic gleam from the image fragment flashed in my mind. It wasn't just a piece of equipment in the lab. It was likely the receiver, the point of contact for whatever this device was transmitting. "Can you trace it?" the lead detective pressed. "I can try," I answered, already rerouting processing power. "But whoever set this up is good. They've masked the primary signal, bounced it through multiple proxies. It's designed to be untraceable." Untraceable. That was the killer's goal, to leave no digital footprint, no evidence. But they'd made a mistake. They'd left the transmitter active. They'd underestimated my ability to find what they tried to hide. The stranger's USB, the corrupted fragments, it wasn't a misdirection, it was a warning. A breadcrumb leading me to the victim's lab to this very moment. The killer knew I was investigating. They knew I was getting close. And they were actively trying to erase me digitally and perhaps physically. The tension in the sterile room coiled tighter, a silent, invisible threat. I had to hurry. The hum of the old fluorescent lights in the hospital basement. "Emergency autopsy requested" was a low thrum against my temples. It was a sound I'd come to associate with the cold, hard facts of death, a stark contrast to the ethereal world of data I usually inhabited. But this case, this impossible locked room, it had a way of dragging me into the tangible, the grim. I stared at the screen, the fragmented data from the stranger's USB drive slowly piecing itself together. It wasn't just corrupted, it had been deliberately wiped, a surgical strike designed to erase a specific set of files. The fragments I'd managed to salvage were like shards of a shattered mirror, reflecting distorted glimpses of something I couldn't quite grasp. A transaction, a name, a location. My colleague, a perpetually rumpled figure with ink stains on his fingers, hovered nearby. "Anything, UserZO?" he asked, his voice a low murmur in the cavernous space. "Almost," I replied, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The transmitter, that was the key. The killer had been sloppy or perhaps overconfident, leaving it active for a brief window. It had broadcasted a faint signal, a ghost in the machine, and I'd managed to triangulate its origin. It led me here to this sterile, echoing basement, a place meant for the final dissection of lives. The victim's digital life was a labyrinth, each encrypted message a dead end, each deleted file a hidden door. But this transmitter, it was a beacon, a mistake so profound it screamed desperation. I felt a familiar prickle of adrenaline, the hunter's instinct sharpening. The killer had underestimated me. They thought they could vanish into the digital ether, leaving no trace. They were wrong. A notification flashed on my secondary monitor. An incoming call, untraceable. My gut clenched. This wasn't a standard inquiry. I patched it through to my secure comms. "UserZO," I responded, my voice tight. A distorted voice, electronically masked, crackled back. "You're getting too close." My breath hitched. This was it, the direct threat. "Who is this?" I demanded, my eyes darting around the dimly lit basement. The shadows seemed to deepen, coalescing into unseen observers. Someone who knows what you're looking for. Investigation is over. A click, and the line went dead. My colleague looked at me, his brow furrowed. What was that? Trouble, I added, my gaze fixed on the main monitor. The data was still coalescing, but now a new urgency pulsed through me. The killer knew I was close, and if they knew, they'd act. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then died. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with a surge of pure, unadulterated focus. This was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about survival. UserZO, my colleague shouted, his voice laced with panic. Stay put, I commanded, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I fumbled for the small, high-intensity flashlight I always kept in my jacket pocket. I could hear movement, not the shuffling of feet, but a more deliberate, stealthy sound, something scraping against concrete. My eyes scanned the periphery of the flashlight's beam. The autopsy tables, the stainless steel instruments, the draped forms beneath white sheets, they all seemed to shift, to take on menacing shapes in the gloom. Then I saw it, a glint of metal near the far wall where the backup generator was housed. Someone was tampering with the power, not just to scare me, but to cripple my equipment, to destroy the data I was so painstakingly recovering. They're trying to shut us down, I muttered, my mind racing. If they cut the power completely and the backup generator failed, all my work would be lost. The fragments, the transmitter data, the digital breadcrumbs, all gone. The scraping sound intensified, followed by a sharp, metallic clink. My colleague let out a strangled gasp. I reached the generator room. The heavy steel door was ajar. Inside, a figure was silhouetted against the faint emergency lighting of the generator itself. They were working with a tool, something I couldn't quite make out. Stop, I yelled, my voice echoing in the confined space. The figure spun around, and for a fleeting second, the beam of my flashlight caught a glimpse of their face. A mask, but the eyes. The figure dropped something and then lunged towards a secondary control panel. My colleague was behind me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to make a choice, pursue the attacker or secure the data. My gaze flickered to the main console, the monitors now blank. The killer was playing for keeps. They weren't just trying to kill me, they were trying to erase the truth, and it had to be decisive. Trouble, I answered, my gaze fixed on the main monitor. The room plunged into absolute darkness, the low hum of the ventilation the only sound. My fingers fumbled for the emergency flashlight on my desk, its beam cutting a shaky swath through the gloom. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. My mind raced, cataloging the possibilities. A power surge, unlikely, given the precise timing. Sabotage, far more probable. They wanted to disrupt my work to buy themselves time, but I'd anticipated this. My entire setup was designed with redundancies, backup power systems that kicked in milliseconds after the main grid failed. The monitors flickered back to life, the hum of the servers a steady reassurance. The data stream, however, had been interrupted. A clean cut. I leaned back, the cool plastic of the flashlight pressing against my temple. They were smart, I'd grant them that. But they were also predictable in their desperation. They'd reacted to my progress. This meant my trap needed to be more refined, more insidious. Not just a digital net, but a lure that would draw them out into the open. My eyes scanned the room, the beam of the flashlight dancing over stacks of hard drives, tangled cables, and the faint sheen of dust on neglected equipment. The victim's digital life was a labyrinth, and I'd spent weeks navigating its dark corridors. Encrypted journals, deleted communication logs, phantom financial transactions, each piece a whisper of the truth. A thought sparked, a dangerous flicker of an idea. What if I fed them what they wanted to see? What if I created a narrative, a digital ghost that would lead them right into my hands? The victim's last known digital footprint was a series of unusual data transfers, large sums of cryptocurrency vanishing into offshore wallets. The killer had likely used these as a smokescreen, a way to disguise their final actions. But what if I amplified those transfers, made them seem like a desperate final act of the victim? I started typing, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I fabricated a series of outgoing transactions, mimicking the victim's established patterns, but with a subtle, escalating urgency. Each transfer was larger than the last, each destination slightly more obscure. I layered in false timestamps, forged confirmation emails, even a supposed final message to a phantom contact, hinting at a hasty departure. It was a digital siren song, designed to attract the shark. The tension in the room was a physical weight. Every keystroke felt like a gamble. I was playing with fire, building a false reality that could easily backfire if I made a single misstep. My internal monologue was a frantic chorus of doubts. Was this too obvious? Would they see through the facade? Or worse, would they recognize it as a trap and simply vanish, leaving me with nothing? I hadn't been able to fully crack its latest security protocols. But perhaps, if the killer believed the victim was still actively moving assets, they might be tempted to make a final, definitive move to secure them. The victim's final days had been spent in a state of heightened paranoia, according to the fragmented logs I'd managed to recover. He'd been expecting someone or something. He'd been trying to secure his most valuable digital assets, a desperate race against an unseen clock. My fabricated narrative would play directly into that fear. I continued to build the digital illusion, adding more layers of obfuscation. I routed the fabricated transactions through a complex web of anonymizing proxies, making them appear to originate from a different continent entirely. I even created a fake news alert, a fabricated report about a new, high-stakes cryptocurrency crackdown in the region where the fabricated transfers seemed to be heading. The goal was to create a sense of impending doom, a reason for the killer to act swiftly and decisively. My breath hitched as I watched the final piece of the puzzle fall into place. A carefully crafted email, addressed to a burner account I knew the killer had used, containing a link to a secure ledger detailing the fabricated transactions. It was designed to look like the victim had accidentally left it accessible, a final, careless oversight. The bait was set. Now all I could do was wait, and hope they took it. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an unseen energy. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the steady whir of the servers, a mechanical heartbeat in the manufactured calm. My own heart, I realized, was beating a little too fast. This was the edge of the precipice. "Trouble," I said, my gaze fixed on the main monitor. The room plunged into absolute darkness, the low hum of the ventilation. I instinctively reached for the backup power switch on my console, my fingers brushing against cold metal. A faint glow emanated from the emergency LEDs, enough to make out shapes but not much else. This was a deliberate move. My heart hammered a steady, insistent rhythm against my ribs. Not fear, not exactly. More like a coiled spring ready to unleash. I'd anticipated this. The digital breadcrumbs I'd been meticulously laying weren't just for the victim's trail, they were a lure, a trap. The victim's most prized possession, a custom-built, air-gapped server containing his life's work, had been rigged, not to destroy but to broadcast. A single encrypted packet scheduled to transmit at precisely 0300 containing the final piece of the puzzle. The killer's digital fingerprint buried deep within the metadata of a deleted file. If they wanted to stop it, they'd have to come to me. I checked the time on my wrist-mounted display, the faint blue light a beacon in the gloom. 02:57, 3 minutes. The air in my makeshift forensic lab, a repurposed section of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, felt thick and heavy, charged with an unseen energy. Dust motes danced in the weak emergency lighting like tiny, anxious ghosts. I could hear the distant drip of water somewhere down the corridor, a slow, rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic thrumming in my ears. My gaze swept over the scattered components, the tangled wires, the cold metal of the hard drives. Every piece of equipment here was a potential weapon, a potential witness. I'd set up a few surprises, a pressure plate under the main access rug, wired to a silent alarm and a strobe light, a motion sensor disguised as a defunct piece of diagnostic equipment, and of course the server itself, its single blinking light a tiny, defiant star in the encroaching dark. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating. I strained my ears, listening for any sound beyond the ambient hum and the persistent drip. A creak of floorboards, a rustle of fabric, anything out of place. Nothing. My own breathing seemed impossibly loud. Doubt, a familiar serpent, began to coil in the back of my mind. Had I miscalculated? Was this a bluff? Or worse, had they found another way in, a way I hadn't anticipated? Then, a faint scrape. From the far end of the corridor near the service entrance. My eyes snapped in that direction. They moved with a peculiar grace, too deliberate for a random intruder. This was my bait taker. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I let them approach, let them believe they had the advantage. The figure paused at the threshold of my lab, their form indistinct. I could make out the glint of something metallic in their hand. A tool, a weapon, looking for something. My voice was a low rasp cutting through the quiet. The figure flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. They didn't respond. That server. I continued, my gaze steady. It's about to send out a very interesting package. Then, a low chuckle, dry and devoid of humor. I read clever, UserZO, too clever for my own good. The voice was distorted, electronically altered, but I recognized the cadence. The same one I'd heard on a few of the victims' encrypted voicemails. Clever enough to know that a digitally locked room isn't impossible to get out of, or into, if I have the right access codes, or if I are the right access code. I gestured towards the server. The metadata doesn't lie. It shows every attempt to access, every deletion, every modification. And there, buried in the ghost data of a file I thought I'd wiped clean, is my signature. The figure took a step forward, the metallic glint catching the faint light again. It was a small, intricate device, a bypass tool perhaps, or something more sinister. I read bluffing. Am I? I pushed a button on my console, the main monitor flickering back to life, displaying a cascade of code. This isn't just a server, I see. It's a time capsule, and its final message is about to go out. A message that proves I weren't just a disgruntled employee or a rival. I was the architect of his demise. I was the one who bypassed his security, not to steal, but to. My fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating the final sequence. The strobe light under the rug flared, momentarily blinding them. They stumbled, giving me the precious seconds I needed. Emergency autopsy protocol initiated, I announced, my voice amplified by the room's acoustics. Digital evidence package transmission commencing. On the monitor, a progress bar filled, rapidly recovering from the strobe, turned towards me, their face now visible in the sudden glare. It was the victim's lead engineer. I won't get away with this, he snarled, lunging again. Actually, I said, stepping back, letting him reach the server. I already have. The progress bar hit 100%. The blinking light on the server turned solid green. The transmission was complete. And as the first data packets began to flood the network, I saw the sudden realization, and then the sheer panic spread across his face. The trap had sprung. The progress bar on the monitor was a blur, a digital race against a ticking clock I couldn't quite hear, still blinking against the sudden illumination, turned towards me. The strobe's afterimage had faded, and now, in the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescence, I saw him clearly. The victim's lead engineer. His face, usually a canvas of focused thought, was now a mask of something ugly, defiance, perhaps, or fear. His voice, raspy and strained, cut through the low hum of the servers. I won't get away with this. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. I traced the digital phantom, pieced together the impossible lock, followed the breadcrumbs of encrypted whispers, and always, I'd been one step behind the real architect of this chaos. Now, standing in the sterile, echoing expanse of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, I felt a sickening lurch. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and final. Get away with what? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. I pushed myself up from the console, my legs stiff. The engineer flinched, a subtle shift of his weight that spoke volumes. He was cornered. "I think I understand," he spat, his eyes darting towards the reinforced door. "I think this is about money, revenge. It's bigger than that." "It's always bigger when I read the one pulling the strings," I countered, taking a slow step forward. The floor tiles were a dull gray, scuffed by countless hurried footsteps. I imagined the frantic rushes, the hushed consultations, the desperate attempts to keep a dying empire from collapsing. He laughed, a dry, brittle sound. I rest so naive. He was going to unleash it, a weapon. He was a fool playing God with code he barely understood. My mind raced. A weapon. The victim, a titan of the tech world, a man obsessed with control and innovation, had been building something dangerous. And this engineer, his protege, his right-hand man, had supposedly intervened. It didn't fit. The digital lock, the staged scene, the carefully curated trail of misdirection, it all pointed to someone trying to frame someone else. But who and why? "So I killed him," I pressed. I stopped him," he corrected, his voice cracking. He was lost. He was going to destroy everything. I circled him, my gaze sweeping over the room. The servers hummed their indifferent tune. This was his domain, his sanctuary, and now it was a cage. I stopped him, but I also made sure no one could get in, no one could see what happened. I locked the room from the inside digitally, so expertly that it looked impossible to breach. And then I staged the scene, making it look like something else entirely. I stopped directly in front of him. I wanted to make it look like he did it to himself, didn't I? Or perhaps another rival. But the timing, the specific encryption keys used, they were yours. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His eyes, wide with a sudden horror, fixed on mine. He finally understood that I wasn't just looking at the data anymore. I was looking at him. The data logs show my access credentials were used to initiate the lockdown sequence just minutes before his estimated time of death. I continued, my voice dropping, and the peculiar pattern of data deletion. It wasn't about hiding evidence of a struggle. It was about wiping the trace of a specific program I'd been developing, a program that could have been used as, well, a weapon. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his chest. No, I read wrong. Am I? I held up a small, encrypted drive I'd recovered from a hidden compartment in his workstation. This contains my personal research notes, the ones I thought I'd securely erased. They detail my concerns about the victim's escalating paranoia, his obsession with control, and my own desperate attempts to create a failsafe. A failsafe that, ironically, I ended up using to trap him. The weight of my words seemed to crush him. He sank to his knees, his head in his hands. The sterile air of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, felt suddenly stifling. The metallic tang I'd smelled earlier was stronger now, a phantom scent of a life extinguished. He was going to release it. I saw the code. It was irreversible. I had to stop him. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I stood there for a moment, watching him. The digital ghost had a face, a name, and a motive. The impossible room, the digital labyrinth, all of it had been a desperate act of a man who believed he was doing the right thing, twisted by fear and a warped sense of duty. The heavy footsteps of the security personnel echoed from the corridor, growing louder. They would take him. The case would be closed. The impossible room, a testament to a killer's ingenuity and a victim's hubris, would be analyzed, dissected, and eventually forgotten. As they led him away, his gaze met mine one last time. There was no defiance now, only a profound, desolate regret. I turned back to the blinking lights of the server room, the hum of the machines now a mournful dirge. I had found the truth, unraveled the threads, and brought a killer to justice.